When Sandra Chen purchased her dream property in the upscale Willowbrook Estates development, she had no idea that her peaceful retirement plan would turn into a nightmare involving property theft, corruption, and a legal battle that would shake the entire community to its core. What started as a simple concern about property boundaries would eventually expose one of the most audacious cases of land theft in the county's history, orchestrated by none other than the person who was supposed to protect the neighborhood's interests. Sandra had spent 35 years working as a civil engineer, saving every penny she could for the day when she could finally purchase her own piece of land and build the home she had always dreamed of. When she found the 2-acre lot at the end of Maple Ridge Drive, she knew immediately that this was a place. The property sat on a gentle hill with views of the surrounding forest, and the large oak trees that dotted the landscape made it feel both private and majestic. The seller had been an elderly gentleman who had owned the land for decades but never built on it, and Sandra was able to purchase it at a reasonable price. She had the property surveyed, the boundaries marked with stakes, and began the process of designing her future home. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had a reputation for being strict but fair, or so Sandra had been told. The HOA President Margaret Thornwood was a woman in her early 50s who had lived in the development for over a decade. Margaret came from old money, and it showed in everything from her designer clothes to her perfectly maintained blonde hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place. She drove a Mercedes SUV with vanity plates that read "Boss Lady," and had a way of speaking to people that made it clear she considered herself several rungs above everyone else on the social ladder. When Sandra first met Margaret at the mandatory new homeowner orientation meeting, the interaction had been brief but memorable. Margaret had looked over Sandra's property information with an expression that could only be described as calculating. She made several comments about how Sandra's lot was in a premium location and how the HOA had very specific architectural guidelines that would need to be followed. Sandra had nodded along, not thinking much of it at the time. She was used to following regulations and codes from her engineering career, and she figured that working with an HOA would be similar to dealing with any other governing body. The first sign that something was wrong came about 6 months after Sandra had purchased her property. She had been busy working on the architectural plans for her house, meeting with contractors, and handling the various permits required for construction. During this time, she noticed that there seemed to be an unusual amount of surveying activity happening near her property line. She saw trucks with surveying equipment parked along the road, and men with measuring tools and stakes walking around what she believed to be her land. When she inquired about it at an HOA meeting, Margaret had given her a dismissive smile and explained that the HOA was simply updating their records of all property boundaries in the development. Sandra accepted this explanation, though something about Margaret's tone had made her uneasy. The woman had a way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes, and there was a quality to her voice that suggested she was explaining something to a child rather than speaking to another adult. But Sandra pushed these concerns aside. She was focused on her own project and didn't want to be the kind of person who saw problems where there weren't any. It wasn't until Sandra drove by her property one afternoon and saw construction equipment clearing trees that alarm bells started ringing in her head. She pulled her car over immediately and walked onto what she knew to be her land, only to be confronted by a construction foreman who informed her that she was trespassing on a private construction site. Sandra stood there in complete shock, looking at the man as if he had just spoken to her in a foreign language. She tried to explain that this was her property, that she had the deed and survey right in her car, but the foreman simply shook his head and told her that he had been hired by Margaret Thornwood to build a house on this lot, and that Miss Thornwood had provided all the necessary documentation proving ownership. Sandra's heart began to pound in her chest as the implications of what was happening started to sink in. She walked back to her car with shaking hands and pulled out the file folder that contained all her property documents. The survey was clear. The deed was clear. This was her land. She called Margaret immediately, but the call went to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. She sent an urgent email explaining what she had just witnessed and demanding an immediate explanation. No response. Over the next 24 hours, Sandra tried every method she could think of to reach Margaret. She called. She emailed. She even drove to Margaret's house and rang the doorbell repeatedly. No one answered, though Sandra could see Margaret's Mercedes parked in the driveway. It was becoming clear that Margaret was avoiding her, and that realization filled Sandra with a cold sense of dread. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was something far worse. Sandra did what any engineer would do when faced with a problem that didn't make sense. She began gathering data. She pulled out her original survey and compared it to what she was seeing at the construction site. She took photographs and measurements. She reviewed her deed multiple times, checking every word and number. And then she did something that would prove to be absolutely crucial to her case. She went to the county recorder's office and pulled up the property records for not just her lot, but for all the surrounding lots as well, including the lot where construction was now taking place. What Sandra discovered made her physically ill. According to the county records, there were now 2 deeds claiming ownership of portions of her property. Her own deed, dated from when she purchased the land, was still on file. But there was also a newer deed, dated approximately 4 months ago, that claimed ownership of roughly 3/4 of an acre of what was clearly her land. And that newer deed listed Margaret Thornwood as the owner. Sandra sat in the county recorder's office, staring at the documents on the screen in front of her, tried to understand how this could have happened. Property ownership wasn't something that could just be changed on a whim. There were processes, legal requirements, documentation that had to be filed and verified. Someone couldn't just create a deed out of thin air and claim ownership of land they didn't own. Except, apparently they could. And Margaret had done exactly that. The more Sandra dug into the records, the more twisted the scheme became. Margaret hadn't simply forged a deed and hoped no one would notice. She had created an elaborate paper trail that made it appear as though Sandra's original property had been incorrectly surveyed, that the property lines had been corrected, and that the corrected survey showed that a significant portion of what Sandra thought was her land had actually always belonged to an adjacent lot. That adjacent lot had supposedly been owned by a holding company, which had then sold it to Margaret. The documents looked official. They had stamps and signatures. They had been filed with the county. And to someone who didn't know the actual history of property, they might have seemed legitimate. But Sandra knew the truth. She had been meticulous when she purchased her property. She had hired one of the best surveying companies in the state. She had walked every inch of her land with the surveyor, had personally witnessed the placement of boundary markers, had reviewed and approved the survey before closing on the property. There had been no error. There had been no adjacent lot owned by a holding company. Margaret had created an entire fictional property transaction to steal Sandra's land. Sandra's next stop was to hire an attorney, and she didn't just hire any attorney. She hired Robert Castellano, a real estate litigation specialist who had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in court. Robert was in his early 60s, a stocky man with gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that made it clear he had seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. When Sandra laid out everything she had discovered, Robert sat back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and let out a long, low whistle. Robert explained to Sandra that what Margaret had done was not just unethical, it was criminal. It was forgery, fraud, and theft on a massive scale. But he also warned her that fighting this case wasn't going to be easy. Margaret clearly had resources and connections. She had managed to get fraudulent documents recorded with the county, which suggested that she either had people helping her or had found loopholes in the system that allowed her to manipulate records. The construction that was already underway suggested that Margaret was confident she would get away with this. And most concerning of all, as the HOA president, Margaret had a certain amount of credibility and authority in the community that could work in her favor. But Robert also told Sandra something that gave her hope. Margaret had made a critical mistake. She had been too greedy. If Margaret had stolen a small strip of land, something that might have been explained away as a legitimate boundary dispute, it would have been much harder to prove malicious intent. But Margaret hadn't stolen a small strip. She had stolen 3/4 of an acre, and she was building a massive mansion on it. The house that was being constructed wasn't a modest home. According to the building permits that Robert pulled, it was an 8,000 square foot luxury estate with a pool, a guest house, and extensive landscaping. Margaret had stolen Sandra's land to build herself a palace, and that level of audacity would actually work in their favor. Robert filed an emergency motion with the court to halt all construction on the disputed property. He provided the original survey, the deed, the the purchase documents, and expert testimony from a surveyor who had originally mapped Sandra's land. He also filed a formal complaint with the district attorney's office, alerting them to what appeared to be a case of real estate fraud. The motion was granted, and construction came to a screeching halt. Margaret, for the first time, was forced to respond. Margaret's response came in the form of a legal filing that was 27 pages long and filled with technical jargon, reference to obscure property laws, and claims that Sandra was the one attempting to commit fraud. Margaret attorneys argued that the original survey of Sandra's property had been flawed, that the corrections had been made by the county after routine review, and that Margaret had purchased the lot in question through legitimate means. They provided copies of all the fraudulent documents that had been filed with the county, presenting them as proof of Margaret's legitimate ownership. What Margaret's attorneys didn't count on was Robert's thoroughness. Robert didn't just rely on Sandra's original survey. He hired 3 different surveying companies to independently verify the property boundaries. All 3 came back with identical results that matched Sandra's original survey exactly. Robert also hired a document examiner to review the paperwork that Margaret had filed with the county. The examiner's report was damning. Multiple documents contained signs of forgery, including inconsistent signatures, anachronistic dating references, and evidence of digital manipulation. The so-called holding company that had supposedly sold the land to Margaret turned out to be a shell corporation registered to a mail drop address, with Margaret listed as the sole officer. But Robert's most devastating discovery came when he started digging into Margaret's history. This wasn't the first time Margaret had been involved in a property dispute. 3 years earlier, in a different county, Margaret had been involved in a boundary dispute with a neighbor. That case had been settled out of court, with the terms sealed, but Robert managed to track down the other party to that dispute. The man, a retired teacher named David Erickson, was more than willing to talk. He explained that Margaret had attempted to claim ownership of a portion of his backyard, using very similar tactics to what she was using now. The case had only been settled because David had been elderly and sick at the time, and his children had convinced him that it was better to just give Margaret a small piece of land and a cash payment rather than go through a lengthy court battle. Armed with this information, Robert filed an amended complaint that painted a picture of Margaret as a serial property thief who had refined her methods over time. He argued that this wasn't a simple boundary dispute between neighbors, but rather a calculated pattern of fraud designed to steal valuable land from unsuspecting property owners. He also filed a motion to depose Margaret under oath, forcing her to answer questions about her property dealings while facing potential perjury charges if she lied. Meanwhile, word of the legal battle was spreading through the Willowbrook Estates community like wildfire. Sandra had initially been hesitant to discuss the case with her neighbors, worried that it might seem like she was stirring up drama. But as more details came out, other residents started coming forward with their own concerns about Margaret's behavior as HOA president. Several homeowners reported that Margaret had been unusually interested in their property lines, asking intrusive questions about surveys and boundaries. One couple mentioned that Margaret had tried to convince them to move their fence, claiming that it was encroaching on common HOA property, though they later verified that the fence was exactly where it should be. Most shocking were the revelations about how Margaret had been managing HOA finances. A group of concerned residents requested an independent audit of the HOA's books, and what they found was staggering. Margaret had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including paying for her own landscaping, funding her luxury vacations under guise of HOA conference attendance, and even using HOA money to pay the surveying companies that had provided the fraudulent surveys for her land grab scheme. Over the course of her tenure as president, Margaret had embezzled more than $200,000 from the HOA. The community erupted. Emergency HOA meetings were called. Margaret was removed from her position as president, though she threatened legal action and claimed that the removal was invalid. Residents who had once considered Margaret a pillar of the community now looked at her with disgust and betrayal. Some admitted that they had always found her intimidating, but had assumed that her aggressive personality was just part of being a strong leader. Now they realized that her intimidation tactics had been designed to keep people from questioning her actions. As the court date approached, Margaret's legal strategy became increasingly desperate. Her attorneys filed motion after motion, try and delay the proceedings, try and get Sandra's evidence excluded, trying to argue that the case should be dismissed on technicalities. Every motion was denied. The judge assigned the case. The Honorable Patricia Wu was a veteran of the bench with a reputation for having no patience for legal games. She made it clear in preliminary hearings that she found the evidence against Margaret deeply troubling, and that she expected both sides to come to court prepared to address the facts of the case, not hide behind procedural tricks. Robert's strategy for the trial was brilliantly simple. He was going to let the evidence speak for itself. He had the original survey, verified by multiple independent experts. He had the deed, proving Sandra's ownership. He had the document examiner's report, proving forgery. He had testimony from the county recorder's office about the irregularities in Margaret's filings. He had evidence of Margaret's previous property dispute. And he had the testimony of multiple Willowbrook Estates residents about Margaret's suspicious behavior and financial misconduct. When the trial finally began, the courtroom was packed. Local news media had picked up the story, fascinated by the tale of an HOA president who had allegedly stolen land to build a mansion. Residents from Willowbrook Estates filled the gallery, wanting to see justice served. And Sandra sat at the plaintiff's table, trying to remain calm despite the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her. This was her life, her dream, her property at stake. If the court ruled against her, she wouldn't just lose her land. She would lose the money she had invested in it, the years of planning and dreaming, and possibly her faith in the justice system itself. Robert's opening statement was measured and factual. He laid out the timeline of events, explained the evidence that would be presented, and told the jury that this was a clear-cut case of theft disguised as a property dispute. Margaret's attorneys countered with an opening statement that tried to paint Margaret as a victim of a misunderstanding who had relied on professional advice and official county records when purchasing what she believed to be a legitimate piece of property. The trial lasted 6 days. Sandra took the stand and walked the jury through her purchase of the property, her careful due diligence, and the shock of discovering that someone was building on her land. The original surveyor testified, explaining in detail how the survey had been conducted and stating unequivocally that there had been no error in his work. The document examiner presented his findings about the forged paperwork. David Erickson testified via video conference about his previous dispute with Margaret and the similar tactics she had used. Margaret's testimony was perhaps the most dramatic moment of the trial. She took the stand wearing a conservative navy suit and pearl necklace, her demeanor calm and collected. Her attorneys asked her to explain her version of events, and Margaret launched into a long, convoluted explanation about how she had found the property listing, how she had been told by a real estate agent that this was a perfect lot, how she had reviewed what she believed to be legitimate county records, and how she had proceeded with the purchase and construction in good faith. But when Robert began his cross-examination, Margaret's composure started to crack. Robert asked her about the Shell Corporation. Margaret stumbled through an explanation about how she had formed it for privacy reasons. Robert asked her about the similarities between this case and her previous property dispute. Margaret became defensive, claiming that the previous case had been completely different and had no bearing on this situation. Robert asked her about the specific signatures on the fraudulent documents and whether those were indeed her signatures. Margaret claimed she couldn't remember signing some of them. Robert asked her about the HOA funds that had been used to pay for surveying work related to her personal property. Margaret's face flushed red, and she stammered that she had intended to reimburse the HOA, but had simply forgotten. With each question, Margaret's story fell apart a little more. She contradicted herself multiple times. She claimed ignorance about details that she clearly should have known if her version of events were true. And most damaging of all, when Robert asked her directly whether she had known that the land she was building on belonged to Sandra Chen, Margaret made the fatal mistake of pausing just a fraction of a second too long before saying no. That pause spoke volumes to everyone in the courtroom. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. They found in favor of Sandra Chen on all counts. The court declared that Sandra was the rightful owner of the entire property, including the portion that Margaret had stolen. Margaret was ordered to cease all construction, remove any structures that had been built on Sandra's land, and pay Sandra substantial damages for the emotional distress, lost time, and legal fees incurred during the dispute. But the legal consequences for Margaret were just beginning. Based on the evidence presented during the civil trial, the district attorney's office filed criminal charges against Margaret for forgery, fraud, theft, and embezzlement. The criminal trial took place 4 months later, and this time, the outcome was even more severe. Margaret was convicted on multiple felony counts and sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 3 years. She was also ordered to pay restitution to both Sandra and the Willowbrook Estates HOA for the funds she had embezzled. The aftermath of the case sent shockwaves through the entire development industry in the region. The county implemented new safeguards to prevent fraudulent property documents from being recorded. HOA regulations were revised to require more oversight and transparency, with mandatory annual audits and term limits for board members. And Willowbrook Estates underwent a complete restructuring, with new leadership that was committed to transparency and accountability. As for Margaret's partially built mansion on Sandra's land, it became a complex legal problem of its own. The construction had progressed far enough that there was a foundation, framing, and rough plumbing and electrical work completed. After consulting with her attorney and contractor, Sandra made the decision to have the entire structure demolished. It was painful to watch valuable materials and workmanship being torn down, but Sandra felt strongly that she didn't want any part of Margaret's theft permanently affixed to her property. The demolition took 2 weeks, and when it was finished, Sandra's land looked much as it had when she first purchased it, though with some scarring from construction and demolition that would take time to heal. Sandra eventually did build her dream home on the property, though it took another 1.5 years before construction was completed. She worked with a different architect and contractor, designed a house that was beautiful but not ostentatious, and made sure that every single permit, survey, and legal document was reviewed multiple times by multiple professionals. The experience had made her cautious, perhaps overly so, but she was determined that nothing like this would ever happen to her again. The day Sandra finally moved into her completed home was bittersweet. She stood on her front porch, looking out at the oak trees and the view that first captured her heart, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the ordeal was finally over. Anger at the years that had been stolen from her by someone's greed. Satisfaction that justice had been served. And underneath it all, a deep gratitude that she had been in a position to fight back, that she had the resources and the determination to stand up against someone who had tried to steal from her. Not everyone would have been able to wage the legal battle that Sandra had waged. Many people faced with a similar situation might have been intimidated by the cost of litigation, by the complexity of real estate law, or by the apparent authority of an HOA president who seemed untouchable. Margaret had clearly counted on this when she chose her victims. She had targeted people she thought wouldn't fight back or couldn't fight back, but she had made a crucial miscalculation when she targeted Sandra Chen. The case became something of a legend in real estate and HOA circles. Legal journals published articles analyzing the case and its implications. HOA management companies used it as a cautionary tale in training materials. And for Sandra, it became a reminder of the importance of vigilance, documentation, and the willingness to stand up for what's right even when doing so is difficult, expensive, and time-consuming. Several years after the case concluded, Sandra was contacted by a local news program that wanted to do a follow-up story. They interviewed her in her beautiful home, now fully settled and decorated, surrounded by the gardens she had planted and the life she had built. The reporter asked her what advice she would give others who might find themselves in a similar situation, facing down someone in a position of power who was trying to take advantage of them. Sandra thought carefully before answering. She talked about the importance of keeping thorough records, of not being afraid to ask questions, of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. She emphasized that property ownership is a serious legal matter, and that anyone purchasing land should invest in professional surveys and title insurance. She explained that HOAs can be wonderful organizations that genuinely improve communities, but they can also be vehicles for abuse when they're run by people with bad intentions and insufficient oversight. But perhaps most importantly, Sandra talked about the necessity of being willing to fight. Fighting is exhausting, she acknowledged. It's expensive, it's stressful, and there are no guarantees of success. But sometimes fighting is the only option. Sometimes people with power and resources will do terrible things if they believe they can get away with it, and the only way to stop them is to stand up and say no. The reporter asked Sandra if she thought Margaret Thornwood truly believed she would get away with stealing someone's land so brazenly. Sandra considered the question for a long moment before responding. She suspected that Margaret had gotten away with similar schemes before, or at least had come close enough to believe that she could do it again. Margaret had built a life based on intimidation, manipulation, and the exploitation of other people's fear and uncertainty. She had been the president of an HOA, a position that gave her automatic credibility and authority. She had money and connections. She had a team of attorneys ready to defend her actions. From Margaret's perspective, taking a little land from someone who seemed less powerful probably felt like a calculated risk worth taking. What Margaret hadn't accounted for was running into someone who was equally calculating, equally determined, and equally willing to use every tool at their disposal to protect what was theirs. Sandra wasn't just fighting for a piece of property. She was fighting for the principle that no one, regardless of their position or their resources, has the right to take what doesn't belong to them. And that principle was worth fighting for, no matter what it cost. As the interview concluded, Sandra walked the reporter out to the edge of her property, where she had installed a decorative iron fence marking the boundary line. Every few feet along the fence, there were small plaques with the survey coordinates, a permanent reminder of exactly where a property began and ended. It might have seemed like overkill to some people, but for Sandra, it represented something important. It represented clarity, certainty, and the vindication of knowing that what was hers was truly, legally, and undeniably hers. Margaret Thornwood was released from prison after serving 3.5 years of her sentence. She moved to a different state, away from the community where her crimes had made her infamous. She filed for bankruptcy, having lost everything in legal fees, restitution payments, and the sale of her assets to cover her debts. The Mercedes with the boss lady plates was sold at auction. The expensive wardrobe was donated to charity shops. The woman who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable had been reduced to rebuilding a life from scratch, and this time she would be doing it with a criminal record and a reputation that would follow her wherever she went. Meanwhile, Willowbrook Estates flourished under new management. The HOA implemented transparent financial practices, regular community meetings where all residents had a voice, and strict ethical guidelines for board members. Property values in the development actually increased once the corruption was rooted out, as potential buyers saw it as a community that had faced a crisis and emerged stronger. Several residents who had been considering moving away decided to stay, heartened by the changes in the sense that they were part of a community that would stand together against wrongdoing. Sandra's story spread beyond just her immediate community. She was invited to speak at property rights conferences, HOA reform groups, and community organization meetings. She always accepted these invitations when her schedule allowed, feeling that if her experience could help even one person avoid a similar nightmare or give them courage to fight back against injustice, then all the pain and struggle would have served a purpose beyond just her own vindication. The oak trees on Sandra's property continued to grow, adding rings to their trunks that would forever contain the memory of the years when the land beneath them was in dispute. But trees don't concern themselves with human conflicts over ownership and boundaries. They simply grow where they're planted, reaching toward the sun, dropping their leaves in autumn and budding again in spring, indifferent to the dramas that unfold in their shadows. For Sandra, those trees became a source of meditation and perspective. When the stress of the legal battle had threatened to overwhelm her, she would walk among those oaks and remind herself that this land had been here long before she owned it and would be here long after she was gone. What mattered wasn't just who held the deed, but how that land was treated, respected, and loved. Margaret had seen the land as nothing more than a commodity to be stolen and exploited. Sandra saw it as a trust, a responsibility, and a gift. This story serves as a powerful reminder that documentation, vigilance, and the courage to stand up against injustice are essential when protecting your property rights. Margaret Thornwood's scheme might have succeeded against someone less prepared or less determined. But Sandra Chen proved that even the most audacious fraud can be defeated when you're willing to fight for what's rightfully yours. If you've enjoyed the story of justice served, please subscribe, and share your own HOA or property dispute experiences in the comments below. Have you ever dealt with someone in a position of power who tried to take advantage of you? How did you handle it? Let's keep the conversation going and help others learn from these real-life battles. Remember, your property rights are worth defending, no matter who's trying to take them away.